one of the things that I always come back to is, in essence, you don't need large numbers. What often brings about change are small numbers of highly radical, committed people, right? And whether that's on the radical left, where you get a kind of 15% of radical progressives in Britain, about 15% of Britain is made up of radical progressives. They are utterly committed to their new religion.
You only need a few thousand people for a Bolshevik revolution.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I think on the other side too, the radical Islamists that are forcing MPs out of office, that are basically, engaging in fraud or leading, child sexual exploitation rings in Northern England and so on. I mean, you only need a small number of people to really make a society feel unsafe, uncaring, dangerous and divisive. And I'm, obviously you can tell, I'm deeply concerned about, it's not actually the pace and scale of the change that we're going to see. I'm more concerned about the complete failure of our leaders to even be honest with people about where we are and what's coming.
So on assimilation, integration, if I can talk now a bit more philosophically, how does a liberal country, we're a liberal country, tolerate people who won't tolerate other peoples? And I guess this is one of the cultural questions we have to ask about culture and migration and immigration. And talking about British values, like you said earlier in this conversation, we don't really talk about what British values are. In fact, British values are kind of shut down and degraded. What are the British values? What are the things that we need to say? This is what it is to be British.
Yeah.
These are the standards that you have to meet if you come in. And then I guess there would be a policy question there as well, which is, what do we have standards for people to come into the country? You already have to speak English fluently, let's say, or you have to. In America, they have a system where you have to answer these crazy questionnaires that even Americans wouldn't, wouldn't pass these tests they did if you want to get a green card. What would you think should be the test here? How do we do it in Britain?
Well, I think firstly that the era of Britain being tolerant of people who are not tolerant of us needs to end. And what I mean by that is the very vague, abstract conversation that we like to have with ourselves about Britishness being about inclusivity, diversity, fairness, tolerance, things that, to be frank, are pretty meaningless when it comes to debates like this. Let me just finish though. We've had over the years repeated attempts to frame Britishness, from New Labour and Tony Blair in 1997 through to David Cameron, attempts to reframe Britishness around very vague, abstract concepts, which I don't think are particularly well suited for the kind of era and changes that we are now living in. So at a minimum, if you do not uphold and respect the rule of law, if you do not respect the sort of British cultural characteristic of fair play, of playing by the rules, of upholding social norms and standards in society, if you are openly denigrating our institutions, the symbols of our ways of life, then those people, those kinds of people, should either be we need a new policy framework for integrating those people, but more of those people should not be encouraged into the country, would be my view. We have to draw a line.
But we have a British tradition of criticising, there's a British tradition of criticising the monarchy that goes back centuries. There's a British...
I'm not saying criticising the monarchy. I'm saying if you are engaging, if you're engaging in criminality, if you're breaking the law, if you're engaging in the industrial scale rape of young white working class girls in northern towns, and you have clearly not integrated or assimilated into the British way of life.
By that point, we need
late. Is it? I mean, we need a much more robust policy response to those violations of who we are. So we need, at a minimum, a much stronger legal and judicial system that makes it clear there are consequences for breaking the rule of law and breaking expectations about what it means to be in this country. And I would argue the criminal system is not doing that. If you go through all of those cases of, as I say, mainly Pakistani Muslim men who were engaged in those gangs, I don't think the sentences were anywhere near hard enough. I think they should have been given, extensive custodial sentences. Those are examples, and I come back to those examples because they really do bring to life the problems that we have with multiculturalism as a society. If you're glorifying Islamist terrorism on the streets of London, there need to be consequences. There need to be visible, serious consequences in order to project to everybody else that we have an expectation around integration. And I don't think we have been doing that. And I don't think also, by the way, just saying, well, to be British is to be welcoming of diversity, doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean anything at all. A fundamental British value, like the liberal, all the liberal tracts and the liberal acts of the 17th century and after the religious wars, and that is fundamental to British values. It's the point is, though, that is not all it is. There's a lot more to it. There's a history, like you mentioned earlier. There's the language that you mentioned.
There's a tolerance, but there's not there is a tolerance, but there's not been a tolerance when it comes to violating the rule of law and violating,
But the problem then, and this is what Oriana Fallaci called libericide, is you can say, the rule of law, but then if you believe in Sharia law, you can't accept the rule of law because Sharia law will always come before it. But the liberal British policy of tolerance means that we'll accept people into Britain who don't believe in the rule of law. So how do you at the border say, if you don't believe in the rule of law, they'll just say, yeah, whatever, I believe, and I'll come in. Like, how do you actually police?
Well, it's the same. I think it's the same question for how do we know whether, the church, for example, in allowing people to convert to Christianity who are clearly not genuine.
That's a terrible scandal. I was reading an article this morning that one pastor in South Wales baptized 500 people, asylum seekers specifically, who said they wanted to convert, and as soon as he'd done the conversion, they disappeared and never saw them again.
But I think as a society, we're going to need to seriously upgrade our expectations of integration and what it means and what we're going to expect of people when they enter into our society, and to ensure that there are consequences when people violate the rule of law and when they violate, procedures and institutions that make us who we are. I mean, if you're, as I say, if you're glorifying Islamic State, if you're engaging in open criminality, there have to be much more serious consequences. We have to start drawing a line in the sand, because I do think on many of these issues we have been too liberal. Yes, of course we've always been liberal, but we've not been liberal to the point of allowing people to undermine who we are as a society, as a country. And I think we have lapsed into that now. When we're giving, senior lieutenants in Hamas the ability to operate within here without any consequences, or IS supporters, we've not been anywhere near as tough as we should have been, and now we're facing the consequences of that.
One thing I noticed is a guy called Dilly Hussein, I should say, who outspoken, I'd say, has come out very strongly anti-Israel, would be putting it neatly, perhaps, or nicely. But one thing I noticed is that he said that Britain is a secular country, and that's just not true. We're a Christian country, and it might be true that a minority of the country actually are Christian, but our values are Christian values, and I think it's very important to assert that we are a Christian country. Do you think we're a Christian country?
Well, we're certainly we are, and we're certainly shaped and influenced by our Christian heritage. But at the same time, I look at large-scale surveys of the population today. Gen Z, Zoomers, 1% identify with the Church of England. 1%. We've never seen that before. We're not practicing, we're not active Christians. Most people would say, on balance, Britain's a Christian country. But the sharp decline in religiosity or Christian faith is very clear in the data. So too, by the way, is a sharp decline in other aspects of Britishness. For example, pride in our national identity among Gen Z has collapsed. Support for the monarchy a symbol of who we are, right? Whatever your views on the monarchy, it is an important symbol of who we are. Support among Gen Z, much lower than other generations. Look at Israel and Gaza. The views among Gen Z, again, very different from older generations. Now, people might say, well, Matt, that's a cohort effect, and over time they'll change and their views will evolve. Maybe, but there's another view, which is these are the kids that have gone through the primary, secondary, university education system who have been exposed to a very openly political view of the world. And we don't know what's going to happen in the years ahead, but we can see that Gen Z are more left-wing than any generation in the past in our recorded history. We've never had an age divide in politics like we've got today, where only 8% of Gen Z are planning to vote Conservative. We didn't have that in the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. This is new. We don't know where that's going. And I think partly, religion plays into that as well. And more fundamentally, it plays into the deeper question of who are we? I mean, if we're not an openly, actively Christian country, or a country that is proud of who we are, proud of our institutions, then what are we? What is actually going to hang us together? We're going to need a lot more than, hey, diversity is our strength. That's going to be our unifying thread. That's not going to be sustainable. That's not going to be enough of a story to hold all the disparate parts together. We're struggling even to hold the union together, never mind holding together a rapidly diversifying society along ethnic, racial, sexual, gender lines, right? It's going to be very, very difficult to do all of that.